Long-term decisions for a brighter future or short-term jockeying for party advantage? Rishi Sunak sets out his stall for the coming election. The northern leg of HS2 is cancelled. The Prime Minister insists that every penny of the £36 billion intended for that rail link will be spent on different projects. There were a raft of other announcements too, sold like this.
Politics doesn't work the way it should. We've had 30 years of a political system which incentivises the easy decision, not the right one. 30 years of vested interests standing in the way of change. 30 years of rhetorical ambition which achieves little more than a short-term headline.
We've gathered politicians to weigh up whether the reformist pitch is credible for a party already in government. Could it even be an election winner? And speaking of 30 years ago, with so many big government schemes, especially in education and health, reliant on private finance deals, we reveal the soaring costs of paying back the debt.
If it wasn't for the contract, we would have more teachers in our schools, we'd have more support staff in our schools, we would have more SEN support for our most vulnerable.
We're joined by John McTernan, Tony Blair's private secretary when PFIs became all the rage, and Labour MP Stella Creasy, who's not a fan. Good evening. There's no doubting the political agility needed by a Prime Minister making a conference speech. You've got to somehow balance slogans about making tough decisions for the long term with that distinctly short-term objective of winning a looming general election. And you've got to sell yourself as the person not afraid to change your mind when the facts change, while simultaneously lambasting Sir Keir Starmer for changing his mind on Brexit. On the main business of the day, ditching the high-speed rail link from Birmingham to Manchester, Mr Sunak drew fire from David Cameron, who wrote that his successor had thrown away 15 years of cross-party consensus. Well, there was a whole lot more to this speech than just switching the HS2 money elsewhere. Here's Nick.
You're going to wave up there at the cameras.
And when the dust settles, as it will, and when the excitement of electioneering dies away, there is work to be done.
An insurgent launching a mission to challenge the status quo from opposition.
This Conservative Party, the party of the grocer's daughter and the pharmacist's son, will always be the party of enterprise, the party of small business.
A link to Margaret Thatcher, from a Prime Minister seeking to ape her insurgency from government.
Politics doesn't work the way it should. We've had 30 years of a political system which incentivises the easy decision, not the right one. 30 years.
And so 3 big decisions to challenge the status quo. Scrapping the Birmingham to Manchester leg of HS2. The £36 billion budget for that will be reinvested in transport projects in the Midlands, the north of England and other parts of the UK. A rolling smoking ban to ensure that no 14-year-old today will ever be allowed to buy a cigarette. And the merging of A-levels and T-levels to put academic and vocational qualifications on the same footing.
And I will be straight with you. We have mountains to overcome still. But today we have made 3 huge decisions to change the direction of our country. If we commit, if we come together, we can achieve truly great things.
Warmth in the hall and cabinet ministers hailing their leader, who wants to be seen as an insurgent.
How can you be the candidate for change
when you're doing it from government after 13 years?
By doing exactly what he's just done, by setting out a really bold, ambitious programme for the country. You know, I think what you've seen there are decisions that lots of people would shy away from, but actually he's taking it on.
It's a big ambition to end 30 years of status quo, but how can you be the insurgent when you're in power?
Because what we are doing is we are making the tough decisions for the future. The Prime Minister set out the really bold decisions that he made when he was Chancellor, with furlough, keeping people in their homes, in their jobs, keeping their families together. So his credentials on willingness to make tough, sometimes unpopular decisions for the long term has been proven by that. And what he has set out now is a set of really important, tough decisions.
Rishi Sunak came here to Manchester with a plan to answer all those critics who've been saying, where's the vision? Well, you couldn't really miss the vision today, charting a new course after 30 years of what he described as failure. There are lots of happy people in his party and lots of unhappy people, and the Prime Minister, well, he's just happy with that. For Labour, this presents a challenge and also potentially an opportunity. The Manchester terminus for the world's first intercity railway to Liverpool. Unity today in opposition to the scrapping of HS2. And Labour's mayor dismissive of the Prime Minister's approach.
Well, who's been in charge of HS2 as Chancellor for a number of years? You know, what government has overseen these spiralling costs over the last 13 years? You can't just kind of turn up at a party conference and sort of rewrite the script and pretend all of that doesn't exist. I'm afraid he has got to recall the fact that George Osborne came to this very place 10 years ago and made huge promises, massive promises to the north of England, promises that have not been kept. So when the Prime Minister stands up today and says, this kind of era of politicians saying things and never delivering, well, I'm sorry, but there are many people in his party who have been doing precisely that over the last 10 years, and I think the Prime Minister himself is in that category too.
The legacy of an industrial giant which changed the world, and the setting today for a Prime Minister recasting himself as the agent of change.
Nick Watt there. Well, there was quite a lot of detail in today's speech, and quite a few of the announcements, like replacing A-levels in England or banning someone now 14 from ever being able to smoke legally, would on another day have attracted major media attention. But in the torrent of policies and ideas unleashed today, many didn't garner much focus. And all of this from a government that will be calling a general election next year. So Joe is at the wall now to separate the wheat from the chaff. Joe.
Thanks, Mark. If you had £36 billion to splash on public transport, where would you spend it? That is exactly how Rishi Sunak is attempting to frame this choice and pose a challenge for Labour using these maps. Do you shove those billions into one section of one high-speed rail project, or spread the love across hundreds of projects in the Midlands and the North, areas jam-packed with constituencies the Tories need to hold on to at the next election? Among the investment, £8.3 billion to fix potholes, and they call it Network North, but quite a lot of these savings are going south. Labour argue they'll need time to look at the numbers before working out their position, but they say at least one of today's 100-plus projects, an extension of the Metrolink tram to Manchester Airport, opened in 2014, and other investments like upgrading the A1 in Northumberland have already been promised by previous PMs.
I think it'll deliver jobs and prosperity here in the North East, and I'm delighted to give it the green light today.
When did a government first promise to dual the A1 to Scotland? I'll tell you, it was 1992. This government is going to get on and do it.
Of course we need to get the A1 dualled. We need to get it dualled from top to bottom.
Other eye-catching announcements include scrapping A-levels and T-levels in England and replacing them with new qualifications called the Advanced British Standard. All 16 to 19-year-olds will typically study 5 subjects, including some English and maths to 18. However, there will be a long wait. The first students to study them are currently just 6 years old, and one veteran of the Department for Education is doubtful they'll ever reach reality.
that it could just not happen at all. I mean, we could end up sticking with A-levels because there'll be 2 more elections at least between now and the point when it would be supposed to happen. And there's this sort of history of education reform is littered with examples of qualifications that have been proposed and never happened. I think if it does happen and the politics does work out and the next government is able to take it forward in some way, then you've got a real challenge with the implementation. And the biggest issue for me with this is the idea of combining vocational and academic courses together, because they're very, very different in nature. If you think about trying to teach someone how to do construction or hairdressing or childcare, that is a very different type of thing to teaching them history or physics.
Now, other new policies include toughening up restrictions on disposable vapes and raising the smoking age in England, currently 18, up by 1 year every year. The proportion of smokers aged 16 plus has been steadily dropping, as you can see here. But Rishi Sunak wants this line to eventually reach zero. Labour will vote for this policy, but Liz Truss will not. Her allies call the move hideously illiberal, and perhaps because of those concerns today, the PM offered some red meat rhetoric for the right, including on trans issues, on sentencing for sexual and sadistic murderers, and on benefit claimants. And there were some other challenges in that speech to the Labour Party. But because the clock is ticking towards a general election, some of what we heard in the speech were commitments, others were more aspirations.
There are 3 questions. The first are there areas in which the Prime Minister might not need full legislation? Here we know that the Prime Minister announced a free vote on those changes to the smoking age, but that might not require a full bill. It might be able to be done through existing powers. The second question is where the government could bring forward legislation in a single term, but might need further time for consultation. So on issues such as regulation of vaping, that might be the approach the government takes there. And then the third question is on those longer term policy issues here, thinking about some of those changes to education policy, also changes to transport policy and the replacement for HS2, which while the government might be able to deliver some of that in the next parliamentary session, ultimately these are long-term policy ambitions which might take up to 5 or 10 years to fully implement and deliver.
The Prime Minister is attempting to position himself as the all-change candidate and not the we're on the right track, let's keep going one. But will voters at the ballot box associate Rishi Sunak with promises in the future or the Conservative record of the past?
Thank you, Joe. Well, in a moment, we'll be joined by Henry Morrison, Chief Executive of the Northern Powerhouse, Vaughan Gething, Economy Minister in the devolved Welsh Government, and Lord Jonathan Marland, who was a minister in the government of David Cameron. He's here in the studio. But first, let's go to Chris Loder, Conservative MP for West Dorset and a supporter of the Prime Minister's decision to cancel the Birmingham to Manchester leg of HS2. Good evening, Chris Loder. New projects, every penny will go on new projects, but £8.3 billion of that is on fixing potholes.
Good evening, Mark. It's good to speak to you this evening. What we've seen from the Prime Minister today is a very clear announcement to basically come to terms with the fact that the High Speed 2 project was wildly overspending. It wasn't going to actually get to Manchester for some 18 years from now. I know, and I know many of the MPs from around this area know, that not just the Greater Manchester area, but the whole north of England wants to see significant transport improvements much more quickly.
But if the money is going on potholes, and some of that in the south of the country as well, of course, as well as some of those rail and other improvements in the south of the country, that's a net negative for the north, isn't it?
I don't think it is a net negative, no. Many of the panellists that are going to share their opinions...
Well, it's nearly a quarter of the money, sorry to jump in, but nearly a quarter of the money on fixing potholes, so...
No.
That's not new transport projects for the north.
What we're seeing very clearly is the moving forward of significant sums of money that will benefit the north here and now, whereas the previous plan, before the Prime Minister's announcement today, was that the benefits would not be felt here for another 18 years. I remember at Transport Select Committee only last year, the Labour mayor of the West Yorkshire area made her views very clear that actually around Bradford and other places actually needed attention. The MP for Keighley and Ilkley, Robbie Moore, has impassionately made his points that his area and indeed the Bradford area needs investment. That is going to happen to the tune of more than £4 billion to give a metro to that area.
People clearly want it, but when is it going to be deliverable? That's surely the question. And how many of these announcements have already been made? I mean, we heard in Joe Pike's piece Boris Johnson saying dual carriageway all the way up the A1 was first announced in 1992. So, I mean, that's not really a new announcement, is it?
Well, I think I'm talking specifically about the railways and the connectivity around Leeds and Bradford in that respect.
Right.
But I have to say that today is a turning point as far as I'm concerned. There is a level of reality which has to come with the fact that when the Infrastructure Projects Authority says that a project like HS2 that has cost the country tens of billions and was projected to go massively overspent, that level of reality check has had to come, and I'm pleased that the Prime Minister has brought that reality check today, because what actually the Prime Minister is doing is saying the people of the North and the Midlands need to see real benefits to connectivity now and as soon as possible, and that's what we're going to see.
It's a different reality, though, to that of David Cameron, isn't it? Who said that Rishi Sunak has thrown away 15 years of cross-party consensus. And then, indeed, he's been retweeted in that sentiment by George Osborne and Boris Johnson. So the Prime Minister's predecessors seem to think he's made the wrong call on this.
Well, we should just bear in mind that they are indeed the Prime Minister's predecessors. I have great affection and huge admiration for David Cameron. He was the person that drew me to the Conservative Party in 2008. But the reality is that David Cameron, as much as I respect him, is not the Prime Minister today. Neither is Boris Johnson, and George Osborne is not the Chancellor. The reality is that the Prime Minister today has said very clearly that this project, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, said it was not deliverable, it was not going to happen. Most of us, and that some of your members on the panel who I listened to on the radio this morning, on Radio 4 this morning, suggested that HS2 was going to connect the cities of the north together. That's actually not correct. HS2 didn't actually connect the cities of the north together. That is what is needed, and that's what the Prime Minister has set out today.
I suppose what David Cameron is getting at, and those other senior Conservatives were following up on, was the question of credibility when you announce a major infrastructure project which by its nature is going to take many years. So do some of the ones that leaders in the north that you were mentioning earlier have set their hopes by, do they stand any greater chance of being completed? Is the government's credibility now undermined for finishing major projects?
I don't think it's the government's credibility. I think the rail industry has got to really take this moment to really look in the mirror. You know, we've seen that the HS2 programme was forecast to be 6 times the amount of a high-speed programme of a similar nature in Europe. That is just unsustainable. The millions and millions of pounds that have gone into consultation after consultation, after survey and planning and others as well.
But that'll all have to happen on many of these other projects as well, won't it? But let's
No, not to the same extent, actually. And we should just be very clear about that. Communities, typically south of Birmingham, where the infrastructure work has happened so far, their lives have been absolutely decimated by this work. So it's not just fair to say that.
Thank you very much for that. Well, let's go now to Henry Morrison of the Northern Powerhouse Consortium. Is this over, or is there still fight left for those who still back the original vision of the high-speed link to Manchester?
I think your previous guest made a couple of factual inaccuracies, which I just wanted to correct first, Mark. So he talked about spending up to $4 billion, or between 2 and 4 billion, on a metro to Bradford. Actually, that's the new line between Bradford and Huddersfield, I think he was referring to. I think the challenge you allude to is that we need a network that connects the whole country. We now won't have that. And specifically east to west, you do need part of HS2 to go from east to west. And in fact, the government has specifically provided in the Prime Minister's speech and in the related announcements for part of HS2, the hybrid bill, to be able to be continued, we hope. And there is 12 billion, part of which will go on what was previously HS2 infrastructure. So I think your previous guest isn't necessarily familiar with the detail of what the government's announced. I'm not sure it got proofread. I know a lot of the numbers were wrong. So it's not surprising maybe that he hasn't read it. I'm not sure all the authors necessarily went through it with a fine-tooth comb. But fundamentally, as long as the current plan for east-west connectivity in the north is continued, there will need to be a hybrid bill, and that bill in Parliament that was part of HS2, which is also the first part of Northern Powerhouse Rail, will need to continue.
Right, so just briefly on that, the bill, the thing that has to make this possible, or indeed in its changed reality possible, is that going to go through, do you think, in the time...
Sorry, Mark, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? The hybrid bill. OK, let's go to Vaughan Gething in Wales. There was, I think, a pleasant surprise in the sense that £1 billion of this 36 billion that was being talked about for Network North is now due to go to electrifying a line through North Wales, if I'm not mistaken. Is that something you welcome, or would you like to have known about that sooner?
Well, if there really is going to be significant investment in the rail network across North Wales, that is good news. The difficulty is the credibility of this plan, because the £1 billion figure is real back of a fag packet stuff. There's no development work that's gone into that to understand how the costs come out. HS2, for all of its challenges on costs, actually had a cost-to-benefit ratio with a business plan around it. In announcing what looks like a big investment in North Wales, they haven't learned any of the lessons of HS2 and controlling costs. If you don't have that development work done, you can't control costs. They don't really know if £1 billion will do it. The other challenge is not just whether we would have liked to have known, but we've actually been working in the Welsh Government with the UK Government on trying to have a set of priority projects across North Wales. There are real issues, for example, in North East Wales, congestion on the rail. There are things we've probably done in Chester and increasing the speed on the lines. This in itself, what's been announced, isn't at the top of those priority lists we've been working with. So yes, I want to see investment made, but I'm afraid this just swaps one fiction for another. It was always a fiction that HS2 would benefit Wales. The government's own impact assessment said that it wouldn't. Now we have the fiction that actually £1 billion will be invested with no credible plan. It isn't a plan, it's a line on a map. And you have to ask yourself, can you really believe that Rishi Sunak will deliver this?
Right.
A government that is running out of steam with an election that has to happen, I think the credibility of this, the fact that there isn't a real plan, will come through. Let's bring in Lord Marland, because you're a Conservative politician, but also offered the job of running HS2.
Well, I was sounded out whether I'd like the job. It took me about a nanosecond to decline.
Yeah. This point about all of the difficulties that are likely to be encountered, for example, as Vaughan Gething was saying on the project in North Wales, but equally on some of the others, is the government not just swapping one big potential, one big cost overrun for a whole set of potential costs?
Well, I think you've got to take it as read and have to audit it very carefully. I mean, if the government are saying they're going to spend 36 million, let's see what it is, where it's going to go, and make sure that it does. That's the real key to this. And, you know, people are fed up with idle promises. But coming back to the main theme, I mean, this project has been a monumental disaster in terms of management. I mean, I was talking to a farmer in Stafford the other day. He said 3 people dug holes underground, protesters. They had 15 people guarding them at 100,000 a day cost, 4.5 million for 45 days. This thing we hear of contractors who've been subcontracting out to the government at 3 times the price of things. So it was a really badly run project.
The Conservative government own this disaster,
well,
don't they?
There is no question that it has been badly run by the Department of Transport and by the rail networks. And you know, the country cannot go on sort of throwing money down a bottomless pit, which is what it's doing at the moment, particularly in this time of financial crisis. So I think Rishi has been very brave. I'm seeing David Cameron tomorrow. He'll probably hit me. I'm seeing George Osborne on Friday, so I'll have 2 black eyes by the end of the week. Thank God I'm not seeing Boris. But the fact is, This has been a very badly managed project. It's actually shameful that the country cannot manage these projects properly because it is important, and we stand on the back of just having done the Elizabeth line, and obviously the connections under London is one of the biggest projects ever done.
Right.
But this project was going wrong. And as was pointed out by your previous speakers, it isn't going to get to Manchester till 2042. So maybe you might say, well, what do I care? Because I'm in my 60s and I might not see the benefit of it. But, I go to Manchester a lot, I go to Leeds a lot. I find the train service extremely good and very efficient.
Right. But given all the difficulties of getting these other projects through in a reasonable amount of time, is the money going to be any more wisely spent? And if the 36 billion has 8 billion taken out for mending potholes, and then there's talk of contractors possibly taking legal action, contractors on the second leg.
No, you're absolutely right.
The money will get frittered away.
I'm not disagreeing with your point. It's absolutely spot on. The fact is, someone's got to get a grip of these people who are managing these projects and audit them as well. And David Cameron says quite rightly this was a cross-party consensus. There'll be a cross-party consensus also that this project should end.
We've just got Henry Morrison back and very little time, I'm sorry to say. Henry Morrison, is the 36 billion going to be frittered away between potholes, legal action by contractors and planning difficulties, all those other things we've been discussing?
I think that there is a solution which the government can and will need to proceed with the real fundamental enabler for this, which is that east-west line. If it can deliver that in full, which is a big chunk of the 34 billion, as well as the sweeties given to the rest of the country, then that will eventually increase productivity. Right. But it does require the bill that's in Parliament not to be messed around with. If that's delayed, that could add 7 more years to getting from Liverpool across to here in Leeds.
I'm very sorry to run out of time and not to be able to bring Vaughan Gething in again, but we've just very quickly got time for an update from Nick Watt up in Manchester. Nick, what did you make of all that?
Well, Mark, this was undoubtedly the most significant speech of Rishi Sunak's premiership. We are now unequivocally in phase 2 of his period. Phase 1, the first year, that was about steadying the ship. Those 5 pledges, they were about managing the inheritance he's had. Now it's phase 2, that is as an agent of change. That's very difficult to do that when you're actually in power, because surely you are responsible for what your party has been doing. And the way that Rishi Sunak is doing that is he's saying that all the prime ministers over the last 30 years, they have presided over a failed consensus, and he's going to challenge that. That involves some noise, that involves some disruption. It feels a bit like the atmosphere of the Vote Leave campaign in Brexit. But the problem with saying that all those prime ministers were failure is that there have been 8 prime ministers since then. There are only 2 prime ministers, Rishi Sunak and Gordon Brown, who didn't have a mandate from the country and didn't have a full mandate from their parties. They're the only 2 who've met those 2 conditions. So it's quite a big, bold move by Rishi Sunak, but I think the feeling is he's well behind in the opinion polls, so you've got to take risks.
Nick Watt, thank you very much indeed in Manchester. Well, with all the ambitious projects unleashed or indeed thwarted today, the question of funding looms large. From new hospitals to transport infrastructure, new projects can capture the public imagination. But when it comes to paying for them, that's a trickier question. So much so that governments had in the past resorted to PFIs or private finance initiatives to raise the money. It's a way of borrowing the capital and then repaying over the long term, a system used widely during the years of the last Labour government. However, a Newsnight investigation has revealed the extent to which rising inflation has hit public institutions with extra costs. We'll ask in a moment whether PFI should be part of future spending plans, and if not, where else a government might find cash for capital spending. First, here's Ben.
The Private Finance Initiative, or PFI, initiated by John Major's Conservatives, rolled out massively by New Labour.
On time and on cost, on time and on cost.
The PFI theory let the private sector build and operate swish new public buildings, including hospitals, and then let the public sector pay off the debt over many decades. It was supposed to keep down the national debt and save public money. But PFI is adding tens of millions of pounds every year to the running costs of institutions like hospitals, relative to if the government had simply borrowed the money to fund the construction itself.
There's another sting in the PFI tail. The repayments of institutions like this London NHS Hospital Trust are linked to inflation. All the risk of higher prices is borne by the borrower, not by the lender. And given the high inflation we've had recently, you can imagine how much extra financial pressure this is imposing. This NHS Trust warned in its most recent financial report that its PFI costs, partly thanks to inflation, had jumped to £40 million a year and pose a significant financial risk.
Indeed, Newsnight, working with the Independent Centre for Health and the Public Interest think tank, has been able to determine that inflation has added costs of almost £500 million to English hospital trusts over the past 2 years. That's equivalent to the salaries of some 7,500 newly qualified nurses. This is on top of the £2 billion they are paying in ordinary PFI charges every year.
In some instances, the payments to PFI companies for some NHS trusts exceed the amount that they spend on drugs. And that was before these very large increases in inflation, which means that the high charges that are being levied on these trusts in order to pay for PFI are inevitably going to have an impact on other available resource for patient care, for paying for staff, for other things that they might want to do.
UK hospitals still have at least £54 billion to repay in PFI charges over the coming decades. But schools built with PFI also owe around £17 billion, and the negative impact of inflation on their annual payment has been similar to that of hospitals. Imran Iqbal, the head of PFI-built Holly Lodge High School in Smethwick, has seen his school's repayments jump to £1.5 million a year because of inflation, 13% of his entire budget. And it's become a serious constraint on what he can spend.
We've got 6, 7 IT rooms, and all of the equipment in those rooms needs replacing. It's nearly a decade old. We've got updates coming through Windows, and we're talking about actually our hardware won't be compatible soon. What we do in school isn't as good because of the financial constraints that we're under than what we would have done if we didn't have that contract. If it wasn't for the contract, we would have more teachers in our schools, we'd have more support staff in our schools, we would have more SEN support for our most vulnerable.
The Department for Education said the department supports schools that have unavoidable extra premises costs related to their PFI contracts through the PFI factor in the school's national funding formula. The Department of Health said, "We are supporting NHS trusts to ensure they're implementing high-quality contract management to achieve better value for money."
The government stopped using PFI in 2018 and inflation is coming down, so you might be wondering why all this matters. Well, it matters because the financial legacy of PFI will be on the shoulders of many schools and hospitals for a long time to come, decades in some cases. This school has another 10 years on its PFI contract. So if inflation comes back over that period, all these financial pressures will also come back.
I want a solution that means that and the impact that it's having on young people is addressed directly. So whether that means renegotiating the contracts, whether that means finding an exit clause for the contracts, I want to stop paying 1.5 million of the school's budget on a contract, and I want to be rerouting at least half of that, which is what we should be doing, back to our young people and the education they receive on a day-to-day basis.
There's another awkward question. With the public finances tight, how is this government or the next one going to finance the construction of more schools and hospitals without PFI? Remember Labour's Building Schools for the Future programme, which the coalition controversially cut in 2010? That was largely PFI.
PFI, unfinished business for the public sector. A problem not consigned to the past, but one that very much still encloses this generation.
Ben Chew with that report. Well, to discuss PFIs for and against, we're joined by Stella Creasy, Labour MP for Walthamstow, and John McTernan, who's here in the studio, who was a senior Downing Street official under Tony Blair. Welcome to you both. Stella Creasy, PFIs allowed the new Labour government to do amazing things, didn't they, in terms of school or hospital building?
Look, governments of all colours have used PFI from 1992 up to 2018. The 700 projects span the decades, but frankly, they are the legal loan sharks of the public sector, because the way in which these contracts are written and the commitments that they make have allowed these companies to not just hike up their fees, but to repeatedly benefit from the fact that we don't let schools and hospitals go bust. So whether it's the dividends that they're paying to the directors, or the fact that we have paid for the inflation increases for these, and you heard from that school, I've got schools in my constituency affected by it.
Well, tell us about that. Tell us about the effects in your constituency.
Well, they're wide-ranging. Look, I represent a constituency that has one of these mythical 40 hospitals that the government is supposed to be able to build, called Whipps Cross. We've been trying to rebuild Whipps Cross for decades now. And if I think about Barts, which owns Whipps Cross as part of its trust and has the largest PFI in the country, well, they were paying £120 million in their PFI payments just a few years ago. It's now 150 million. The rebuild for my hospital would be 900 million. So actually, we could have covered the cost of building the new hospital that my community so desperately needs if we got a grip of the PFI contract.
Okay.
And it's not just in healthcare, it's in schools as well.
Let's put that to John McTernan then. It's drawing money out that should be being spent on patients or school children. Good idea at the time, but now people are paying the price.
The problem in health, the problem in schools and education, is that for the last 13 years, the Tory government have forced austerity into health and education. Schools, hospitals don't have enough money for their running costs. That's the actual problem. It's nothing to do with the PFI. It's simply to do with the fact that public service has been starved of money. And the reason that Labour introduced the PFI in 1997 was we inherited a situation where primary schools in England still had outside toilets, and hospitals need to be rebuilt, and housing needs to be built, and housing needs to be renovated, and the whole of the public sphere had to be rebuilt. And rather than making people wait their turn in the queue, we did it all. We built actual hospitals, not the 40 fictional hospitals that are promised but not being delivered by this government.
We can see the appeal and the achievements, but you can't just dismiss the idea that a school is paying a third of its budget on these repayments, or a hospital a quarter, by just saying the budget isn't big enough.
Well, of course you can, because the schools' budgets have been hammered down by the government. If the schools' budgets had kept in line with the increases that Labour were giving...
So none of it's the Labour government's fault?
None of it is Labour.
You could have foreseen how long these deals would last and that interest rates might go up.
None of it is Labour's fault, because there's been a Tory government for 13 years cutting public service spending. PFI built hospitals, built schools, renovated the rail network, and it is the government's fault for not funding public services since 2010.
All right.
Nothing for Labour to cop.
Stella Creasy, do you go along with that, or do you accept some responsibility for the previous Labour government in creating this situation?
John is right that public services have been cut to the bone by this government. But just as if a constituent came to me and said that they've been using a buy now, pay later loan to pay for their mortgage, so I'd want to look at the mis-selling that's gone on. So I think we have to recognise the way in which PFI is structured is hugely expensive, and we are committed to a further £200 billion worth of repayments. It makes good fiscal sense to look at whether those contracts are fair. I'll give you a good example of this. Many of these contracts were signed when these companies signed up to pay a much higher level of corporation tax, and that was part of the value for money assessment.
Right.
Now, over the years, corporation tax has been cut. So clearly they are getting a better deal, and it's right that we look at whether we as the public sector could get a better deal and put some of that money back into our schools and hospitals.
Let's look forward, John, rather than arguing about how we got here, or clearly austerity has had a big impact. But Labour government may well be holding the purse strings fairly soon.
And we'll have to use...
Do you revisit, as Stella's saying?
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind. Labour will come in with the worst crisis in the public square, in the public sphere, in terms of capital, because we've got the water industry pumping sewage, raw sewage into rivers. You've got schools which have crumbling concrete. You've got
the cost of mending PFIs.
Well, we're going to have to deal with every single element of what we come in. Because the government have been strangling public services, we'll have to find a way to put more revenue in. And the Labour identified tax increases to switch into particular bits of service. In terms of the capital required to do everything we want over the first term, and I hope the second term of a Labour government, if we get elected, will need to go back to the private sector. We cannot borrow as a government the amounts of capital we need to renovate the country. So we'll have to find
PFI 2.0.
Well, we'll have to have some kind of public-private partnership, because if we don't, we'll have to be saying, if health gets this, schools can't get that. That's not acceptable. We'll have to find an acceptable way of lowering the cost of capital for the private sector, and then finding a way to borrow with them, to work with them, to invest with them, sometimes de-risking for investments in energy, but sometimes actually having a public-private partnership. At 2.0, there's a lot to learn, but the problem we have is high inflation. High inflation, it increases all costs, and if you don't get enough cash...
I haven't got much time, and I do want to go back to Stella on this, but just briefly on HS2, PFI, to finish that up to Manchester, would a Labour government take any different view, or is it, frankly, someone else's problem that they'd rather not be dealing with?
I think the cancellation of HS2 is a betrayal of the North, is a betrayal of the commitment to raising and to reducing regional inequality. And a Labour government has to be able to do the kind of transformative infrastructure investment we need in all the spheres.
Stella Creasy, last word. Does the sound of resorting to PFI in a different form perhaps fill you with hope or dread? And what would you do about HS2?
Look, we had to learn the lessons about having used the private sector in such an expensive, exorbitant way, just as we did with payday lenders and buy now, pay later lenders. So the public sector needs to get better. Things like sovereign wealth funds, I think, are part of the solution, separating out the service management contracts from any kind of investment, and recognising that letting profit being made within the NHS is money that can be going into public services. So we need to get better at managing projects ourselves.
Stella Creasy, John McTurnan, thank you both indeed very much. Just time for a very brief look at the front pages. The Daily Telegraph, huge decisions to change Britain on the Rishi Sunak speech. The Mirror, well, they're calling it a train wreck. Sunak condemns the North to a future of decline, they say. The Daily Mail, the day Rishi gave the Tories a reason to believe he can save us from Keir's wokery, going on the non-rail aspects of the speech today, shall we say. And then The Guardian, Sunak ignites Tory civil war after declaring he is the change candidate. Well, this particular high-speed programme has arrived on time at its destination. That's all from us. Do join us again tomorrow. Good night.